like even in my comics now, like I always feel like you should more or less be able to see everything coming. Like you shouldn't. I don't think like Katie Kohler is sort of I guess for the viewing audience, it's not really done yet, but it's about to be done.
Hmm.
Um, like I don't think that the way that it plays out for the title character should really be surprising to you if you read along. Like, but like I think that's also fine. Like, there's no reason why everything has to be like, oh, bet you didn't see that coming. Like, you should see it coming. You're reading it. You're if you're understanding the character and the characters and their motivations, you should sort of be able to you know, see what's coming. But I also that could just be me because I already know what's coming, which
Yeah.
is sometimes the most difficult thing is sort of like um, when you know it. Like I think one of the most basic problems people have with comics is like making sure that you are passing off the requisite amount of information to the reader that they need because like you might know characters' motivations and their backstories and how they got to that point, but like you actually have to put that in your story for other people to know that they're not just going to pick up on what's in your head on your own. And
Yeah.
like especially early on, I struggled with that of like oh, this character feels this way about this thing, and then it's like okay, but that's not here. So how are we supposed to know that?
Yeah.
But I think you sort of develop a feel for that over time because you also don't want to like for me, I don't want to waste well not waste people's time but like I don't want to have like huge text heavy pages that are just like explaining what's in a character's head all the time. I'd rather try to pass that on visually,
Yeah.
but I don't think it's like either way is the better approach. That's just my approach. That's how you know I sort of look at it. I don't it could just be that I don't think um like narration heavy stories I've never felt comfortable writing them. I always feel like I'll have like one thing to say or two things to say in a narration, and then I feel like I'm just forcing it for the rest of it in order to keep something consistent.
I've always had trouble reading books like that too, that are very
Yeah,
caption heavy. I'm like, I don't like this could be a novel at this point. Like
yeah,
very rare do I see someone have a writing that's worth reading on its own, b pictures that are worth seeing on their own, and then c like cross informing each other in a really worthwhile way where you can't strip away one or the other.
yeah,
Like
and and
if the writing and art's really firing as well as it should be, they should be cross informing too.
yeah, and that's the thing is like sometimes I'll think like oh I should have caption boxes or whatever, and it maybe works for like a page or two, and then it's like oh I kind of that was all I needed to say. I don't need them anymore. And then you get into like, do you want that to be for like the first two pages and then it never happens again? Or, can you come up with a better way of of doing that? Like a lot of what I try to do now is um I really don't want to waste even a page in a comic, you know what I mean? Like I don't want
Yeah.
to have even one page out of 60 or whatever that's just like useless. You know what I mean? Or
Yeah.
just like you have to have, like every story you write is going to have scenes that like, okay, I have to have this scene even if it's not super interesting because you need it for other things. But I really try to if it's something you have to have for the plot or something, maybe that's when you add a little bit of humor so that you're getting something from it. It's not just like a dead page just to set up future events or whatever.
Yeah.
It's or like maybe that's the page where you do something interesting on the drawing side of things, and then that'll justify, you know, its existence. Like it really is like people don't like. I guess people want like sometimes they want like an easier answer, but like when you're making comics, this probably applies to other things too. Like the way you get better at them is just by doing them and just by doing them a lot and doing them for a long time. Like if you just even if it's not like finished artwork, if you just like sketched out like a full story, you'll be sort of amazed how much of a better understanding you have for it at the end than you did when you started, even if it's
Hmm.
not, even if it's not necessarily good, like you will understand something that you didn't at the start. You will have some shorthand or whatever, or figure out some little lesson that will benefit you going forward. Um, yeah, and it's so like I've been doing it for like 10 years, so you get the feel of it, and so like each individual thing, because a lot of it is just like conveying information through your pictures, right? And so it's like you just it becomes like second nature of like how you express an emotion, or how you express use how you're going to use color to help you tell your story, to either how to indicate certain things or tones or stuff like that, and you just sort of like pick up things as you go, and by the next thing you know, you're working on things, and you're doing things without even really thinking about it. It's just like instinctual, like this is how I get this across, and this is how I get this across. And
And that's earned by labor.
yeah, it's like there really is no shorthand to it, because like even if you read comics your whole life, when you get to actually making them, you're gonna come across like, oh, like the other day, or not the other day, but I was working on a comic that had like a subway in it, and I was like trying to think of this, like the not just the sound of a subway, but like how to get that across in like in
Hmm.
a text thing or whatever. And it's like, oh, I've never even considered this before. And it's like I've ridden subways and I've read comics my whole life, and I just like it just never hit me. And I was like scrambling around. And then I tried to like find other comics and what they used for that sound and whatnot. And it's like at some point I feel like I need like a database of sound effects and what passes for one thing or another.
That's a tough one because it's like it grows and shrinks,
Yeah, yeah.
right?
That's
Like
the
the coming of it is a
yeah,
different thing.
that's the thing. And then there's like in comics, it's sort of like you can figure out how to like doing motion and things like that. You can figure out how to do it, but then sometimes you need to do it in like a very succinct way. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? Where it's like you can show motion like panel over the course of panels and whatnot, but sometimes you have to do it in one panel, and then it's like a whole different thing where like you thought you had this trick to get this information across, but now you have to do it in a different way. So it's like even as you learn lessons, you sort of have to learn how to do them in different ways, or you'll have to do it in different styles, like like light and stuff like that. Like if you're cross hatching, you learn how to show light in one way. Then
Hmm.
you work on a comic where you don't do it, and it's like, oh shit, I still have to show how light works, but I don't have that tool that I used. So then you
Yeah.
have to come up with a new way of doing it. So it really is like every page you do, you're probably learning something that you didn't really know before. Um, yeah,
How much, as one crazy person to another, how much are you walking around at work with the just mentally trying to solve the problem of the subway sound or all of these
yeah,
different.
that sort of stuff is constant. Like typically, a lot of how I get through stories is just walking around, like just walking around and letting it play out in your head. Because what you really want is, like I said before, about like if you're reading the story, you should sort of get a sense of where it's going. Like part of what I think is not like when I'm developing a story is not necessarily like what do I think is going to be the most creative or the most dramatic or the most tense or whatever, but like how would this situation resolve itself with these characters in
Hmm.
this, how would it actually happen? Not like what I want to happen, but like these, just put these characters in the world and sort of like let it like obviously I'm still the one creating it, but like let it play out almost like as though you're removed from it and you're just watching it
Hmm.
unfold. So yeah, I spend a lot of time just like walking around, head in the clouds. No, uh, people probably think like, say hi to me on the street, and I'm like pulled back to reality, and like I don't know what's going on. Like I did, but yeah, it's a lot of that because they they really do, you know, like they take a lot of time, a lot of development, a lot of, it's very difficult, I think, to, at least to me, to just like come up with an idea on Monday and just like immediately start going with it. Like I typically want to like, you know, I'll try to write out, if I have an idea, I'll try to write out everything that I can think about it at that moment. And then it's like, then you let it sit there and you think about it more, and you think about like, oh, are you coming up with something original, or are you just like rehashing some movie or book you read when you were 15 and you didn't realize it, and then it's like, oh no,
Yeah.
that's somebody else's thing. Like I gotta do something totally different. Yeah. So there is a lot of that, especially like, you know, especially at work, or like playing video games or something, and you're sort of like, you've got like one, or honestly, like I go to the movies a lot, and a lot of the time it's sort of like like I think of movies way more than I think of even comics when I'm thinking about comics, because
Mm,
like originally, like especially when I was in school, like teachers would put these problems to you, and I think about it constantly as like reading something in a book or watching something on TV, and then thinking about how you would do that in a comic, where like you can't just make, it's not like just a storyboard, like you have to come up with an entirely new way of presenting that same information. So like I spend a lot of times even just sitting in movies and thinking, not even thinking about the movie I'm watching, but thinking about, it'll send me off on some other story that I've had partially written, and then it's like, oh, okay, now it's clicking, and I can see like what that character is going to do, and what choices they're going to make, and what that's going to lead to. So yeah, there's a lot of like, I personally like, I think you have to sometimes force yourself to work on something, because like you can't just like, if you want to actually get things done, you can't just be like, I'll get to it when I feel like it, because you might never feel like it, it
I
might
think
never come
inspiration's a
together.
lie. Yeah. Like
Uh,
if you're waiting to be inspired, you ain't gonna make it.
yeah, like I think it's fine if you sort of jot down an idea, and I'll come back to that later. But like you do actually have to come back to it later, even if it doesn't develop on its own. Like you go back and look at it again, look at it fresh, and a lot of times, like when you actually sit down to work on something, the pieces sort of fit together a lot better than you would have thought. Like I've sort of, and I don't know how much of this is a true accident, and how much of this is like some sort of like instinctual storytelling knowledge or something like that. But like I fall ass backwards into story things all the time, where
Hmm.
like whether it's like uh, a choice I made that I didn't really think about. I just sort of threw it in there, and then you get to the end of the story, and it's like, oh, actually, that thing that I introduced is going to tie in very well, like to this ending. Or like when I was working on Orange, I had like a totally different ending in mind, and then as I was working on the last issue, I was like, that's when I really sat down and thought, and like, oh, that ending doesn't really work anymore. I've got
Hmm.
to completely redo things, and I was at a loss. I was like, I have no idea how to finish this. And then I went back and reread the whole story from start to finish, and I sort of picked up on not like plot threads, but like little things that I put in there that I didn't really finish. I didn't really bring back or tie up or anything like that. So then I was like, okay, well, I got to tie those things up. And then from there, an ending sort of materialized itself, because you have these things you have to do to make to tie up things that you brought up before, and it sort of rounds out nicely, and you know can fit together pretty well sometimes. So yeah, sometimes you are sort of just a little bit fortunate with you know things, stories progress in ways that you didn't necessarily plan on, but you look at it and it's like, okay, that actually does make sense, that ties together, that fits with you know, sometimes you start a story and you have the story in mind, but you don't really know like themes or what you're hoping to get across. And then by the time you get to the end, that's when you sort of know, like, oh, this is what it's actually about. Like I knew what was happening, but I didn't know what it was about. I didn't know what I wanted from this character or whatever. And so
Yeah,
sometimes, yeah,
that's what I was going to ask next as you're describing this is like when you're going through that process, how much are you learning about your intentions or how much like personal problem solving do you feel like is going on just through your process in general?
it really varies because sometimes, you know, like sometimes I'll do the lazy writer thing of just like, oh, on this page they're gonna have a conversation. I don't know what the conversation is, but like I'll figure that out later. And then you work on all the other stuff and everything's tied together, and then you go to draw it and it's like, okay, I've got this like 2 or 3 page dialogue scene where I know something needs to be there, where like I know how it needs to end, but I don't know what they're talking about in between there. And like, sometimes your brain just starts finding these connections, and next thing you know, like you got a really nice scene put together, and it just sort of like snapped to on its own. And like especially dialogue was a thing that especially when I was starting out, like I had no faith in my ability to write dialogue whatsoever. Like I had no clue, when you have characters and they're trying to like make these not speeches but like little monologues about their life or whatever, and you're looking at it and you're like, is this just like, is this nothing? Does this mean anything? Is this just rambling? Is someone gonna roll their eyes when they read this or whatever? And then I sort of got some early feedback of like, oh no, that was really good. And I was like, okay, I have some level of faith in myself that I kind of know what I'm doing, and I can at least rely on that going forward. But yeah, I don't know about like personal problem solvings, because honestly, like even the stuff that is based on my life, it tends to be like years removed. Like I tend
Mm-hmm.
to like, I don't really want to write about something that happened in my life until it's more or less wrapped up. So I know uh ultimately it came to its resolution. Like I couldn't imagine writing about something while you're sort of in the middle of it, because you know you don't really know how it's going to go. And then while you're working on it, that's when it is resolving itself. So now the events that you're putting forth fictionally might be totally different than how things actually played out. And then,
Yeah.
not that that's necessarily a bad thing. You can always, you know like there are a couple. I don't know if there's any that I actually have done, but there are a couple story ideas I got from like moments where I thought about something or thought about doing something, and then almost immediately we're like, "That's stupid. Like, don't do that." And then it's like, well, in my own life, I understand that's stupid, but like, it might not be a bad thing to write a story with a character that didn't come to that conclusion and did
Yeah.
do that, and you know, so yeah, I mean, like, I don't have like a particularly eventful life necessarily, and I've still managed to mine like 2,000 pages worth of story out of it. So like I feel like most people probably have enough, if you know how to get to it, if you know how to like craft it into a narrative or
Yeah.
whatever, or something. Like I've taken a lot of like very um banal things and sort of like, you know, tried to present them in a way that had weight to them, when, depending on how you frame a story is a lot of whether it's good or not. Like, now that I've spent 10 years of my life telling stories, sometimes I'll have friends of mine that tell stories, and if I know the story, I'll be like, you told that in like the worst way possible. Like like there's no humor to it, or
Yeah.
anything. You're all over the place. And so like part of it is just figuring out like not just the information, but how you're going to present it, especially in comics, because you have to present it, as a story, but also you have to present it visually. Like you have to I tried to come up with, for most of the comics, like some sort of visual, um, link throughout it, or like some little visual trick that's like exclusive to that thing, and
Like for
because
instance, in Orange, the bed is like the kind of
yeah,
central symbol throughout. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about?
yeah, so that's like a direct ripoff. That's in college, senior year, I had David Mazzucchelli as my teacher, and like
Hmm.
growing up, I was a huge fan of his comics. And in Born Again, the Daredevil comic, like there many of the
Yeah.
chapters open with like these top down views of like Matt Murdock laying in bed or whatnot,
Yeah.
and it's not a one for one, but like that was definitely at the time I was thinking like, oh, that could be a thing. And then next thing you know, I was opening, I think like just about every issue except for there's one that doesn't follow the issue 6 of Orange. It doesn't follow the main character at all. But
Hmm.
like I think in mostly every other one, that sort of top down shot of the bed is somewhere there. And it's like, obviously you could frame it differently. You don't have, or you could frame it however you want, but I do think it's nice to have these like consistent visual things throughout a story where it's like it doesn't really change anything, you know what I mean? But it does add a nice rhythm to things.
Well, no, it adds like some symbolic weight, like this thing starts to accrue meaning over time
Yeah,
within
yeah.
the themes of the story, which was something I think that's one of the things that actually remembering back, I read I'm going to blank on the name, but the first one I read of yours was the one where the guy was making comics, and I was like, oh shit, this stuff's not as good as I thought it was. It's just going to be a comic book creator making comics about making comics. And I said, but there's no way that's what all of these are.
No.
And like once I saw it in context, it was like, okay. But then, yeah, Orange was the second thing I read. And it was that thematic accumulation and symbolism and stuff that even without kind of understanding this like fractal kaleidoscope quilt patchwork thing that you got going on, I was like, yeah, this guy, he obviously understands the the connection between visual and writing and what comics are. And yeah, that one really stands out in my mind. The other thing is place seems really important to you. I get the sense that everywhere that's kind of a major touch point throughout the series, Detroit, New Jersey, I feel like New York as well. It seems like all places that you've been. And I think another thing that drew me into Orange was that feeling of richness because I spent 4 years in Michigan in the Detroit area, and you drew the characters going to the Cranbrook Academy of Art Museum, which is where I
Mhm.
went to grad school. And I was like, that's the fucking Cranbrook Museum. Like, so can you talk about place in your work?
Oh, absolutely. So I hate to shatter your view on it, but I've never been to Detroit. I've never even
Really? Wow.
that's the one of them that's just like completely. So I'm a Red Wings fan, so that's why I based it in
Okay.
Detroit. And yeah, I've never actually been there, and a lot of it was just like photo reference for things like that. But
Okay.
but most all the others, like the New Jersey stuff, it's all like um it's either based on like the suburbs where I grew up in New Jersey, or like some parts of Jersey City where I lived for times, or like in New York, like Katie Color takes place literally in the apartment in Brooklyn that I lived in
Okay.
for 5 years. So like a lot of the individual places are places that I knew well enough. Well, like I usually set them in at least like buildings or rooms that I'm familiar with, because when you're coming up, like especially if you're setting a long story in somewhere, you got to draw panels from so many different angles. Do you have to have a really good sense of place, because every you might not even think about it, but like you're gonna have different panels that show different parts of like a house or something. And next thing you like, when I was doing Orange, I didn't think about that stuff at first, and then I think there might be some inconsistencies where like you see something in the background of one room, and then later in the story, like 5 6 years later, when there's a scene I never envisioned in my life, and it takes place in a different part, and then you have to, like, those things have to add up and they have to match, and you have to, like, if there's stairs going up somewhere, they have to, you have to show the bottom of them. And so there's I find it way easier to use places that I'm familiar with, except for Orange, where, yeah, I've never been to Detroit.
Well, you convinced me because I was like, hey,
Okay.
like I've walked exactly through that
Yeah.
scene like many times. I knew, yeah, I knew exactly where I was at. For a while I was like, okay, this guy's lived in Detroit. I even looked up. I was like, did he go to Cranbrook too? Like,
No.
is this
No,
another?
that's very, like, one thing. When I was when I was working on Dugisi God, I knew it was always going to be a 4-part series, but I was always going to print them in as individual comics, because like I didn't have the patience to wait until the whole thing was done, you know.
Hmm.
And one of the things I really was afraid of was that, you know, that sense of, like, is if you just read like issue 2, is that going to make any sense or whatever? And I felt the same way when I was drawing Orange, of like, okay, I'm looking at photo references for these places, but like I haven't actually walked on these streets, and am I going to be able to? Is it going to feel like a real place? Is not even necessarily like if you lived in Detroit or whatever, but just like to a regular person, is this going to feel like a real place, or is it going to feel like someplace, like if you watch a movie and it's supposed to be set in one town, but they clearly filmed it somewhere else, and like you can't get over the fact that, like, that's definitely not the proper setting. Like,
Yeah,
it's not so much that, like, um I don't know, it's sort of like the visual stuff that we were talking about, where it's not the most important thing necessarily, but if you want people to connect to it, it does matter a lot. Like, it does,
yeah,
as much as like the characters need to feel like people, like the places they're in need to feel like a real place that you can, you've been yourself, or you knew someone who was in some place like that, and it feels real to you. Because if it doesn't, I do think you're sort of at a remove from everything else that goes on. If it
yeah.
feels like, these characters are in outer space or something like that. Like, I also I really enjoyed drawing backgrounds. I enjoy drawing backgrounds more than I enjoy drawing characters for the most part. So, like,
Wow.
the sense of setting is like, that's the thing that I would prefer. Like, I mostly want to draw like the location, and then sort of, airdrop a character into it. So part of it is that, but it's um like I was saying before, like, you have to find the individual things that sort of compel you to want to work on something. Because, like, if you're doing even like a 20-page comic, like, it still takes forever, and you got to have
Yeah.
things that are going to engage you on each page or each panel or something like that. Because, like, I back when I started, I used to feel like I went through this growth where when I started, I would have like one panel on a page that felt really good to me, and the others were sort of like, I don't know about that. That's not great. And then I got to the point where it was like most of the panels on the page were good, but there was always one panel that I was just like, damn, I just didn't get it with that one. Like, the framing is off, or whatever. And part of that is like trying to find a compelling something compelling in each individual panel that makes you, like, reasonably excited to draw that panel, where you're not like, oh my god, here we go, we got like that's why I don't love having tons of panels of just like talking heads,
Hmm.
because, like, I think that's boring to look at, but I also think it gets boring to draw. Like, sometimes I do it just to, like, you know let a page breathe a little bit more, or like give myself a little bit of a rest. Like, if I've got 4 panels with like heavy background details, like, okay, give me one panel where it's just like a face and I can get through it relatively quickly. But, like, yeah, I think the setting is, and part of it is like when you're having the the connectedness of a lot of the stories, or like the setting is a big part of that, is like these people are in the same area, these people, and so the space has to feel somewhat realistic because these people need to cross paths with each other, and so their little part of the world has to be in relation to other parts of the world. It can't just be its own separate, you know, entity unto itself.
Well, and it seems like the setting must be driving some of the writing of the characters too, and that like Katie Kohler to me doesn't feel like someone who could have come out of the small town that's kind of at the center of everything. She
Yeah.
feels like she has lived more in New York her whole life or something like that. So is that like a big part of it too? Like, does the setting influence your how you're conceiving of the characters?
With her specifically, it did because a lot of my characters are just like kids from the suburbs. And so this was one of my first forays into like, like the part of my life where I lived in Brooklyn and it's like, I didn't want to have like her roommate is one of these characters who like came from the suburbs to the
Yeah.
city. And so I didn't want to have like, I don't want every character to be like that. So that one was a very conscious, like, yeah, I don't want her to have anything to do with the suburbs or anywhere else. It's like she's a city person and that's that.
Yeah, that comes across very clearly. Is there like does that what it was the name of the town? There's one town that's kind of like the hub of all the stories as far as like
Yeah. So it's called Garen,
okay,
uh,
yeah.
which is pretty much just it's based on the town I grew up in, but with some liberties taken, which is why I like having it be like a fictional place because,
Yeah.
I'll take like it's sort of a big town, like in terms of area. And so like, but I like having the characters walk around a little bit. So sometimes I'll just sort of cheat and like this place that's actually on the other side of town, we'll just like move that over a little bit so they can get there on foot. So yeah. So a lot of the individual places are based on real places, which again, I do so that I can have some frame of reference for not just like, okay, you have this building, but also like what's next to the building, what's behind the building, what's in front of the building. Like you might not need it, especially like when you're coming back to like I come back to these characters over and over again. You sort of need to know that because in this story it might not be important. Like a story 4 or 5 years from now, it might be like what's behind this building might factor into the story now, and so you kind of
Yeah.
have to have a sense of that. So that doesn't necessarily relate to other people and how they go about things, but it relates heavily to how I do it.
That makes sense because the longer you read your stuff, and I think that's why on those 2 days where I just like the further I got in, the more and more I was just like trying to read as fast as I can, is because you do start to understand that function of this might show up later.
Yeah,
And like anytime a new character comes up, like as a reader, you start going, what's their backstory? Like I've never had that reading experience before where a background character actually mattered because they were just a background character. And that is a very key component about what was so exciting to your comics is that I started being like, oh, I can't wait for this story. I can't wait for this story. And
yeah.
that's such a strange thing for background characters. And I really can't think of anything else I've seen that done to that extent before. And so that makes a
Well,
lot of sense where a place would constrain that too.
yeah. Well, I think the earliest part of it for me was like when I was in high school or whatever. I read a lot of Stephen King books, and that's like
Mm,
not to this degree, but like he would often have like this random minor character like also shows up in a different one or like maybe they're the main character or whatever. I think that's probably what started me on it. But
mm,
like you were saying, like thinking about these characters, like that's how Katie Collar came about. In It's very like you wouldn't even notice unless you were looking for it, but like there's a scene in Doogie See God where they're at a bar and she's in the background, and that was
oh,
and so like that's how she started. I was just like drawing background characters, and like I had these big crowd scenes, and so like I had to keep drawing the same people in different places in the backgrounds. And I started like, as I'm working on this stuff for like hours at a time, start being like, okay, well, like I don't want just people standing perfectly still in the background. So like, why are they there? And what are they, what brought them out there tonight? And then so with her, that's how it started, where I was like,
Oh.
oh, she is there to meet her friends, but they haven't shown up yet. And then like that's on the background of one page. And then when I get to the next page, it's like you start thinking like, well, why didn't they show up? And it's like, oh, maybe they're mad at her. Like maybe she did something that they didn't like, and now she thinks everything's good, but everything's not good. And then that's sort of how that story started. So I do use it as like a jumping off point quite a bit, or like sometimes it'll just be like I usually consider myself like a writer first and then
Yeah.
an artist. And so I don't really love designing characters. It's not like my favorite part. And when I specifically set out to design a character, I feel like I tend to make them very boring looking. So in backgrounds, sometimes I'll get a little bit more cartoony or, you know, more creative in terms of the design of a character, because it's like, you can just have some random weird looking person in the background or whatever. And then sometimes if I have a character that's, I don't really have any sense of, sometimes I'll just take characters from the backgrounds of other stories because I've already drawn them, I've already sort
Yeah.
of designed them, and it's like, why design a whole new character when I've got thousands of pages of characters in the backgrounds of other things. And it's like,
And
if
we know they're in the area, so
yeah,
why
it's
wouldn't
like if they're all in the same, like one of the first comics I did was called Revenant, and it's about a kid who comes back home from college, and um nobody remembers him. Like he's like going around town, and like nobody has any recollection of him. And so that character ends up becoming like a pretty prominent character throughout. And there was like a background character in like two panels or whatever in the story, where he's going around and asking people that he knew, like, oh, do you remember me? And they're like, no, I don't remember you. So like one of the characters, when I later on had another story that needed like this secondary character, I just took one of the characters that he spoke to in that and reused them, because like
mm-hmm.
they're clearly still around. And you know yeah, I don't want to waste, especially when you design like a nice looking character in the background or whatever, like you don't want to let that go to waste.
Hearing you talk about this, it all makes total sense that this is your process, but also I'm like, Jesus, like no, I don't get the sense that anyone else is working that way. Everyone else is like, fuck, I gotta draw some background characters to say, like, oh, well, I need her for 3 more panels, and how would she move? And that's what comes through just as a pitch for people watching this. Still, that this is what grabbed me about the work, is that I think we've been being pitched comics as literature for a long time, and that kind of attention to stuff is what's like, this feels like one of the first things I read, having read a shitload of comics, that's actually living up to that hype because of that depth of perception in each character. Not that there's not a ton of great comics, but to see this over 2,000 pages with, I'm assuming, a lifetime to go, with that
Yeah.
much consideration, you're building the, he said, yeah, like, Jesus, fuck, what did
Yeah.
I sign up for?
Yeah, at this point I think I'm in too deep. I don't know how I would, like, what I would do with my life if I stopped. Like it's just such a, even like just taking a break, like it's just such a huge chunk of your time. It's like, you know, you would need to fill it with something. I don't know. I guess people like get married and have kids and fill it with that, but like, you know,
Do you go nuts when you're not like I'll do that where I'm like, fuck, I'm so tired of working, I'm gonna spend all weekend just reading, and then I got like about 4 or 5 hours of just sitting there reading, then I'm like, why am I wasting time on other people's stuff? I gotta go make my own thing.
yeah, I do from time to time, because you do, especially like I found the last 2-ish years have been sort of the toughest in terms of, like, this past year, for whatever reason, I just like go through these long stretches of not feeling like working on things. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like I feel like it's happened to me in the past where like you maybe feel like that for a week or something, and then it's like, okay, now I'm back. And for some reason this past year, a lot of it has felt like more of a grind than normal. But
Mm.
but for some reason the past couple months have been okay. I'm back. I'm more committed to working on things. I'm actually like, inking a page and enjoying inking it instead of making it feel like work or whatever. Um, so yeah, I don't even remember what the I was good.
Oh,
Yeah, I had something that I was, but then we sort of moved on
I
to
was just
something else. But
asking like how how long you can spend with other people's stuff before you start feeling that pull.
I feel it almost constantly, like because I've tried to. One of the reasons that I have my set schedule like I do is to not overwork myself, because
Hmm.
sometimes if you don't, like, I try to get 3 pages done a week. And
Okay.
so like there are some weeks where those 3 pages come very easily. And and in years past I would just do 4 or 5 or 6 or whatever. I would just keep going.
Yeah.
And so I've sort of done that just to pull back a little bit and like, okay, you got your 3 pages done. Now you can go sit on the couch and play video games and watch a movie and not feel guilty about not spending your time wisely, because it's like that's what I committed to and I did it and that's fine.
Yeah.
But there are times where, especially when I'll start off and I don't feel like working, and then the hours go by, and then it's like I really should have done like one more page, and I'd put myself in a much better position. And why did I waste that time? And you feel sort of like guilty about it after the fact. But I mean, you also really do need to step away from things from time to time. You can't just, you know I guess if you were like a robot or something, you could be like, I need to use my time as efficiently as possible. But like when you're a human, sometimes you just need to like sit on the couch and do literally nothing, just like zone out for 20 minutes or something before getting to work on something. Like just before we hopped on, I had inked some pages, but I left like the 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 flat blacks and a little bit of cross hatching undone. So I was working on that before. And then like when I finished that, I was like, I guess I could have scanned some things or whatever. But then I was just like, no, I'm just gonna sit here and do absolutely nothing. And yeah, it's like all things. You got to find the balance, and you have to find the balance that works for you. Like, especially like I work full time, so I have a set schedule where like I ink pages when I come home from work. And I do it like right away when I get home from work, because I know if I sit around for a couple hours, I'm never going to be able to get that sort of motivation back again.
Yeah.
And then like I color pages on the weekend, and it pretty much like first thing in the morning I get right to it, because I know like there are some times where I can like push things to the afternoon and then get to it, but for the most part, if I don't get it done right away in the day, it's just not going to happen. And so it's like you got to sort of figure out what works best for you. Like a lot of kids I went to school with, they couldn't do things unless they were like up against the deadline, It was like
Yeah.
they and I wasn't like that even in school. Like I never pulled like all-nighters or stuff. I just like worked consistently throughout a semester and finished things out. But there are other people who like they need that pressure to really get going, and then they can like bang out a bunch of work all at once. But like that doesn't work for me. I would be panic stricken trying to do it that way.
Oh, I
So
when I was in school, I mean, whether it was essay or I didn't go to an art school, but like any kind of work, like if I had an essay that was due 2 weeks out, I would be doing it the night I got it, so I didn't have to worry about it, and then I could
yeah,
go on to do other stuff. And I wonder because you said like most of those people that you were in school with dropped off, and when I was at Mocha, I also picked up the little anthologies that they give out from SVA, and
yeah,
they were giving out ones from like 2018, 2019 as well. And I went through there and like almost every one of them, I was like, I really like this artist. This is a well told story. I look them up, couldn't find a single one of them I
Yeah.
had like 4 anthologies and maybe 2 artists were still doing comics. A couple of them were doing illustration, maybe, and like no one else. I thought this is so much talent, but that's those kids that were they need the deadline. And as soon
Yeah.
as you take away the mandate of an assignment, they're going to get distracted.
I do
And
think specifically coming from art school, it's a huge adjustment because when we were at SVA, like every project you work on, you get to run it past a professionally trained cartoon. Like all the teachers there are people you can read their work. Like they're not
yeah,
hypothetical cartoonists. They are all actual cartoonists, and you get their feedback on things, and they can help you avoid pitfalls, and they know tricks that you haven't learned yet, and they can help you. And then for the most part in every class, like you put your work up on a wall and all your peers get around and you look at what they're doing and you look at what you're doing. And then like school ends and maybe you keep like a strong group of them together, but for the most part, like you're kind of just on your own now. And it's like
yeah,
all those decisions that you were like maybe you came up with the decision, but you ran it past a bunch of people and like, just to see if it passes the smell test of like, you say like, I'm thinking about doing this, and do people cringe and do people, they're like, no, that's not a great idea. And then, like the first comic I did where I was out of school, like I was terrified the whole time because I was like, does this make any sense? Is this interesting at all? Like
yeah,
I was just like sitting in my room drawing it, and like I have no idea if this is worthwhile at all. And yeah, it's you know it's not an easy adjustment, I don't think. And then especially with comics, like it's not like comics is this field that's just like has a ton of ample opportunity. Like they're pretty, especially for like the kind of stuff I do. Like there's not like tons and tons of publishers looking to bring people on. It's like uh, so you can very easily sort of get lost in feeling like, oh, I'm doing all this work and it's not really paying off, and can I continue on it if it's not going to pay off? And even when it does pay off, like it's not like it's a field that pays out a lot of money even when you're very successful.
yeah,
Like so I could see why people, like for me, I think I would probably do this stuff even if, obviously I have a different job, but even if I was like a filmmaker or something, I could see myself still working on this in my free time or whatever. Like it's a I've I've always really loved telling stories, and um this was the most natural way of telling stories that I ever experienced. Like I would try to write short stories or whatever, and it just never felt right. It never
mm,
felt like I could, I'd start off strong, and then next thing you know, it's like page two, and I'm like, I have no idea what to say anymore. Like I'm thinking of how it plays out visually in my head, and I have no idea how to put that into words or put that into words worth reading. I know how to describe it very simply and plainly, but like that, nobody wants to read. Nobody wants to read that. But when it comes to comics, it just, it makes a lot more sense to me. And getting back to something you were talking about before, like part of the uh, part of the thing, and especially early on, that really appealed to me about comics is figuring out ways to use comics that other mediums can't really do or can't do in the same way. Like like there are things in comics that you can express that are just literally impossible in other forms. And like you see it with sometimes when they'll adapt a comic or whatever, and they'll do like sort of stupid, like they do like the panels on the thing, and it's like you're trying to replicate something that you can't do. Like you're a totally different avenue for telling a story. You should focus on that. You should focus on trying to mimic this thing that you're never like. Comics are never going to be like are never going to be the written word. Like they're two separate things, and they could both
yeah,
be equally valid, but like you have to go about doing things in different ways. Like if you ever read a book and like they can like You know, you can have like mysterious characters because they can just be talking and you don't know who they are, and you can keep a mystery going. And then like you watch a movie and it's like, well, that person needs to talk now, so they need to have a voice. So you know, unless you're going to just straight up lie to people, they're going to hear that voice and know who it is. And
Yeah.
you know, in comics, you don't have to draw that person, and you can do like the you know shaded, and you can't see who they are, but it's just not the same thing. And if you try to um, you can't emulate it. You have to adapt it. You have to change how it's perceived, and you have to change how you go about it. And especially early on, I was trying to, with every comic I did, trying to have that be a focal point of like um, having things that like if it was a different medium, they would struggle to be able to do this in the way that I'm doing it here.
Yeah.
And not that they couldn't do it better or worse or whatever, but they couldn't do it exactly like I'm doing it. And I wouldn't say that I think for the most part I still have things like that because when you do comics, like you have the inherent break of like a page, you know what I mean? Like and I know like books also have pages, but they work in totally different ways, you know? Like
There's
the
not that like ability to suck the whole page in all at
yeah,
once. Like you, it's more linear.
yeah,
Whereas a
like you
comic, you're kind of seeing the end while you're reading the beginning.
exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
So like when you're reading, like sometimes your eyes will drift ahead and you'll read parts of a book, you know, beforehand. But like for the most part, you're just going line by line, word by word. Whereas a comic, you see the entire page. You most of the times you see two pages at once, so you have to be careful about how you reveal certain information. Like, is it going to be after a page break or something like that? And then you also have the individual panels, and then you have how you arrange them. So like you can't just put them however you want because you have to put them in a way that people can follow the action from one to the next. You know, if you present it in a way that is backwards or confusing, or maybe you want to put it backwards or confusing, you can do it that way. And then you have, you know, like let the reader try to figure out what the hell's going on. Like you have that opportunity. It's like a very, you know, like each medium has its own strengths and weaknesses, but like um some of the ones that comics give you are make for really interesting ways to tell a story. And I don't want to be like, oh, other people aren't, you know, taking advantage of all the things comics can do, but like you've read comics where like they're pretty by the book and don't really push things too far in terms of like really what can be done on the page. And I wouldn't say I'm pushing the envelope or anything like that, but I do like to have, you know, I like to have something where you look at it and you go, okay, this could only be in a comic. You can't get this, you know, you can't get this exact thing anywhere else.
And it makes sense to me that you had classes with Kelly because he's such a potent comics formalist, especially with like Asteros Polyp or something like that. And stylistically, actually, I think the Katie Kohler stuff, that's where I really see like, oh, he,
Mhm.
you know, some of the coloration and the clean line and all of that seems reminiscent of some of Asteros Polyp. But yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me because the it seems like there's that stuff is getting ramped up the longer you go to, like in some of the more recent works where I saw these really like tricky formless page layouts. I'm gonna blank on which one it's in. I think it might be I don't believe in ghosts, but there's one issue where you have like one big scene and it's the same scene and there's characters moving around in it, and then you're rearranging where the panels are so that you can keep a consistent like 1 2 3 1 2 3 on the word balloons, but then they're kind of jumping back and forth between panels and then this one like super image that they're imposed on. And that's the kind of stuff that it's like you could only do that in a comic. You couldn't
Yeah,
do, I mean, you could, yeah, it would be fucking stupid in a movie because you'd have like it paused and the characters talking here and um
yeah,
it
and I like stuff like that. Sometimes that like I like I don't every comic I do. I'm like, oh, I have some novel, great. Like I just make honestly, I just make too many comics to come up with that many like cool ideas. You know what I mean? Like some of them are just very basic or whatever, but like you know, even within that, like you get you have the opportunity to whether it's like there were times where I did not want to use sound effects or whatever, and then now I've sort of relented and you know now you can I try to use sound effects in a somewhat interesting way, but like because I don't know for a while it felt very childish of like you know to just have like a word and like oh that's that's the sound of rain and whatnot. It's like it's not really the sound of rain. It's just a word on it, but like but then you also whether it's through color or through style or whatever like sometimes you want to evoke certain moods or certain things throughout and like it's you can do comics where you just like this is accidental but like if you were to read Orange now like the drawing style is totally different in the first issue than it is in the last. Now the reason for that is because one I did in like 2013 or whatever, and the last one I just did this past year. So like
Yeah.
that's the reason. But if a person reads them all together, they're not going to know that. They're just going to it's going to look like oh wow he's changing style every issue or whatever, and it's like that wasn't my plan. It just sort of worked out that way. The time gaps were so long that it forced its way and like I can't imagine there's all that many different forms where you could have that sort of within one thing just like radically change every page if you want every panel if you wanted to.
Yeah. I think that's one of the things that I really like about comics, that because you have this interconnected, everything's connected. Um, I always like creators where I feel like I can appreciate their body of work as the total statement rather than like, oh, they did this book and they did this book and they're all disconnected. There's the ability in comics to see one person, one creator who's doing everything. They don't have to work with anyone else. And you can watch a person grow, not just artistically, but in their opinions on life. That seems something that's particular to the medium as well. And yeah, I wasn't sitting there reading Orange going like, why the hell is he changing? Because I read it all except the last issue. I read it all, in an afternoon. But um, it's that ability. Yeah, there's something about that where someone can really encode themselves and their progression as a human being in a way that I don't think enough people are taking advantage of in comics, but B, I don't think you could do, maybe in music you could do that, but really not in any other medium. And
Yeah,
that's a pretty special thing.
and you sort of probably just sort of stumble upon it sometimes where like you put more of yourself into it than like I've done in the past where I'll put some little bit or like some little piece of dialogue and then looking back on it, it was like, oh, I didn't even realize that I was pulling that from it. And sometimes if you read like every comic I've done, there'll be these beats that repeat themselves. And it started off not even intentional. It's just like I would come across, you know, the same sort of piece of dialogue or whatever, and I would word it the same way. And it's like, because I'm making the same decision both times. But when you're viewing it as an entire thing, it's these beats that keep repeating and whatnot. And then, they sort of feed in on themselves and you're able to have these nice little beats that, like I said, like if you read one thing you should hopefully just enjoy it on its own. But then if you
Yeah.
read these other things, it's like, okay, now this opens up a whole different thing to me because this character that I didn't really feel anything for, they're just sort of in the background and talking to somebody. But in this other story, they're the main character, and now I feel an immense amount of sympathy for them. And then you go back and read it, and now it's like, I would hope you think of them as like almost like, oh, this is like an old friend of mine, and now I get to
Mm-hmm.
see what they're up to, and um, yeah, yeah,
When you're
it's
talking about beats, that's actually something I really like in the last couple back and forth we've had, I realized I should have asked about way earlier, because it's a fascinating part. I think the most consistent part of like whatever your look is you're very comfortable leaving a lot of page untouched, and your panels will kind of bounce around, and there's like a musical nature to how you do it. So you're saying beats, there's kind of that
Yeah.
throughout your whole practice. What, and that's from the jump. Like that's pretty much
Yeah.
in all of your books. Can you talk more about that approach
Well,
to laying out a page?
Make sure to like, smash that subscribe button, and ring that bell.